All right, and we're live. Welcome to the first edition of Two Persians, One Rice Cooker. My name is Sina and this other guy who's also online is my co-host Bayan Furatan. Now, before there are any questions about our relation, no, we're not brothers. No, we're not a gay couple. We're cousins.
Yeah, make sure that second one is pretty important to get out of the way. We definitely do not want to have any confusion about that.
Exactly, especially with your wife next door.
Exactly.
How's she doing these days?
She's good. She's very good. She has her graduation ceremony in 6 days, so that's pretty exciting. But she's
great.
chilling otherwise, yeah.
That's awesome, man.
Keeping up the Laverne legacy, you know?
Man, let's not talk about that school. That school is a badge of dishonor on my integrity.
Let's cut that out unless we want my dad to dishonor us. And let's keep it in just for that.
Oh, man. What do we even call that? A paradox?
Yeah, we would call that a paradox.
Something like that. Well, before we keep going, I think some form of introductions are in order. In terms of who we are, what we're currently doing, what we might be talking about, and how we're wholly unqualified to talk about the topics we're about to talk.
Yeah.
So, I'll let you do the honors.
Thank you. So, my name is Bayan Furutan, as Sina mentioned earlier. Right now, I work as an auditor for a public accounting firm. Nothing too crazy, you know. The most common question is, do I do taxes? No, I do not do taxes. But I do accounting, so I guess that doesn't really matter either. But that is what I do, just to be clear. And like I said, graduated from the University of Laverne with a bachelor in accounting. But just even how this whole thing started for me was that Sina and I were always really intrigued by all these diverse subjects and loved to talk about them and have debates about them, and that to the point that one day we thought, hey, these conversations seem interesting enough that they could potentially become a podcast, and so here we go.
Yeah. Well, I think the key word there is probably seem.
Yeah.
They seem interesting to us, and maybe only us.
Yeah, let's see.
But either way, I mean, I'm fine with that because, I mean, for me personally, I wanted to start this thing because I wanted to have a forum for intellectual discourse.
Yeah.
And whether or not anybody actually views this podcast or gets anything out of this podcast, at the very least, the two of us will get something out of it. So
I agree.
I think that's what matters. Okay, I guess you got your introduction out of the way. I'll start with mine. Sina Furatan. Like Bayan, I'm also a graduate from Laverne. I came out of it with an undergrad in history, with an emphasis on public history. And it was interesting because, I mean, Bayan is correct in that we had engaged in a ton of debates, whether it involves politics, whether it involves philosophy, whether we're talking about social dynamics, cultural dynamics. We went through a whole plethora of issues, and we would constantly have these long conversations that would last 40 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. Sometimes we had debates that would last several weeks. Like, we couldn't resolve them. And then eventually we'd have to have some sort of signed ultimatum or resolution on whether or not we could, like, agree to disagree on certain issues. Like, I remember one of them was on Palestine and Israel, and we were on it for weeks. It was terrible, absolutely terrible. But I'm glad that we're over that.
Yeah.
And yeah, so for this particular entry of this podcast, we thought we should start by talking a little bit about our heritage. And when I mean heritage, I mean the political circumstances surrounding the country of our parents, Iran. And we are just going to do like a sort of breakdown of the geopolitical circumstances surrounding the country currently and how it got there. Was that a pretty abrupt transition?
No, I don't think so. And I do want to touch on one thing before we really get into it, though, which is that although we are not qualified in the sense that we are not experts on the issue, we do, however, take care to, thoroughly research the subject before we even get into it. So we will look at, historically relevant documents, whether they are from the Office of the Historian, whether it's Britannica, whether it's Wikipedia, of course. No, I'm kidding. But we try to...
God damn it.
I know, I'm sorry. But we try to look at reputable sources and books and other sources of information to make sure that we are as informed as possible and do not just, make things up.
You can't end that statement with reputable sources while immediately listing your last source as Wikipedia.
I meant it as a joke.
Yeah, I don't care. We already lost any semblance of reputation that we've had. Well, you're speaking for yourself there. Me, I just look at Wikipedia entries and Twitter entries. Yeah, that's about it.
Yeah,
so
I agree.
Don't depend on me, the historian in this particular podcast.
Yeah.
I mean, the accountant is a lot more reliable. Okay, I'm joking too. No, I think I've done enough research to say that I'm feeling confident enough to talk about this particular issue for the upcoming hour, 30 minutes, or 2 hours, or however long it takes us to get through it. So, I mean, is there anything else you want to get out of the way before we started?
So to actually answer your question, no, I think we're good to go.
Alrighty, let's do it. So I went over a lot, and the one topic the one portion of this topic that was of particular interest to me, it was a rabbit hole that I couldn't get out of, was the U.S.'s involvement with the overthrow of Mossadegh. The more I read into this, the more I just thought, this is a piece of fiction. Like, this cannot be real.
Yeah.
It is utterly insane. Just full disclosure, the National Security Archives basically released a compilation of transcripts, documents, and correspondence involving, correspondence as well as there were a few analytical reports that came out as well concerning the operational capacity of the overthrow of Mossadegh. And I think the name of this particular operation was Ajax. Am I right there? Yeah. And these documents go into detail. I mean, let's talk about these government documents that were released, because they go into the most meticulous detail with relation to every possible scenario that can involve the potential overthrow of Mossadegh. They list out his factions that support him, as well as the opposition. They basically psychoanalyze the Shah at a certain section of these documents, and it's bizarre.
I don't even know if necessarily bizarre is the right word, but it's actually scary. I don't know. When I was reading through it, I was getting scared, because you always hear about the CIA, having its dirty little fingers everywhere and involving themselves in everything, but it sounds too much like some wacko propaganda stuff that you would hear on some, weird guy's YouTube channel who says that when you drink a Monster drink, because when you drink it upside down, the tea is upside down, so you're the Antichrist. Like that type of propaganda stuff. But then you look at those documents, as you were mentioning, from the government itself, they publish that themselves from their own archives. So it's not a third-party source. This is directly, if right now we were to go on the website of the Office of the Historian from the Secretary of State, then we would see all of those documents present right there. And like you were saying, what was scaring me was just the deep involvement. I mean, it's not just top-down type involvement of, oh, there are some officials that we have influence over. No, it's like they know street gang leader in Iran who they were going to use to have mobs in the street attack people. They knew like the village leaders that they were going to employ for their purposes. And I even wrote down a whole list. I definitely want to give you a chance to give some more insight into this beforehand, but I kind of wrote down in my notes a list of things that the CIA was stating that on one hand they have access to, and on the other hand also a list of prioritized, items that they need to take care of in order to get done what they want to get done. And it's very extreme, actually.
Yeah, so apparently from what I could recollect, Fazlullah Zahidi, right?
Yes.
The general / Senate member / Secretary of the Interior for Mossadegh's administration until he was eventually kicked out because from what I can remember, there were all these pro-nationalist rallies, and he suppressed them, and it resulted in the death of about 20 people, and 2,000 or so people were injured. I forget the exact date to when this exactly happened, but this resulted in Zahidi's resignation as Secretary of the Interior. But I think it's important to just give people a general historical background as to what were the current geopolitical dynamics surrounding Iran at that point. So the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was founded in 1908, and it was after this one British venture capitalist by the name of Darcy. He basically purchased all the rights to prospect oil in Iran. And this was in 1901. It was called the Darcy Concession. In 1908, he founded all that oil. And after that point, the concession still applied. But eventually Darcy, he became bankrupt and eventually had to fold the rights to all that Iranian oil to what was eventually known as the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And in 1933, I think at that point the Shah, he signed an agreement with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to extend the Darcy concession, as well as give more of a majority, more of the revenue that was eventually more of the revenue that was gained would eventually go to the British government, because at that point, I think 51% of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was owned by the British government, so they had a majority share on the company.
Yeah.
So, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I remember in a PBS article that I was reading that apparently the share, the profit sharing was that the British would give Iran 16% of the profits once everything was said and done, but that usually the British would not really share their accounting or how they got to that number with Iran at that point in time. And so, but even so, I mean, 16% when that oil that they are profiting from is coming out of your country is just grotesque. And then, of course, all of the corruption that was involved from the top down, who would then pocket that money or use it for their own benefit, was also a huge problem. And that, I mean, that really contributed to this whole mess that, emerged after that as well.
Right. Well, it was a big point of contention for the Iranian people at that point, especially after 1933. I remember that the Shah's son at the time, who eventually overtook the position of his father, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, he was at that point he was actually a pretty, from all accounts that I've read, he was actually eventually became a very good politician, and he put his foot down when it came to the oil deals that were eventually after Mossadegh's overthrow. So there was a lot of contention over this deal because it got a 32-year extension after 1933, and that's when Mossadegh's party, the National Movement, came into place and then stated, we're going to nationalize oil. We're going to nationalize our oil. We're going to make sure that the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company don't have a majority share on how much they could gain from our exports. It was yeah.
The thing was that the interesting thing to me was actually that at the beginning, the British went to the International Court of Justice and were trying to push back legally against Mossadegh, essentially nullifying that agreement and saying that we are not going to participate in this kind of transaction anymore. And it was turned down due to some legal technicalities, not even because the contract itself posed any problems in the sense of it was based on terms and conditions that are one-sided and allow the complete exploitation of the Iranian people, but rather just due to some legal technicalities of, that contract was established before a certain date, which was when they joined, etc., etc. So that was a little bit of a turning point too, because up until then, there was not really any intervention in the sense of, the Brits or Americans infiltrating Iran's sovereignty in order to gain access to the oil again. Up until that point, they were mostly trying to use legal channels. And, the other thing is that the biggest problem with all of this is also that another thing that was going on during that time was obviously all of the contention between the West and the USSR. And due to that, there was always this scare that was propagated throughout the West, specifically the British and the US, that they would say, well, the reason why we need to intervene is because if we don't, then the Russians will get the oil. And if the Russians get the oil, then the communists will have an edge on us, and we cannot give the communists any ground whatsoever. No, go ahead.
In fact, that was actually a big reason why the Eisenhower administration eventually intervened. They assumed that the Communist Party in Iran, TUDA, would eventually take over the Iranian government and they'll overthrow the current Iranian government. So, in many respects, this was analogous to, let's say, the Vietnam War or the eventual involvement in Cuba with relation to the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was just more in relation to the communist scare. But again, I think that was only a minor factor in the long run, because ultimately the reason why Mossadegh was overthrown was because he threatened the pillar of Britain's economy, which was their claim over Iranian oil. And that's why, I mean, when you read reports that Winston Churchill, who at the time was the current prime minister, and then Anthony Eden, who was the foreign secretary at the time, had express approval to overthrow Mossadegh at that point. It's like it really makes you look at these supposed Western heroes with another lens. I mean, Winston Churchill is constantly looked upon as like the savior of the West.
Yeah.
But we don't really talk about his involvement in India, or we don't talk about how he basically crippled and stifled Iranians' potential economic and democratic growth because they want to continuously plunder the country of its natural resources.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one thing that was actually really interesting to me in all of this, which was that, I mean, both Eisenhower and Churchill were obviously also involved in World War II efforts. And the part that was really crazy to me is that in the CIA report itself, it explicitly states that Zahedi was actually identified as having sorry, I wrote it down actually almost exactly word for word what they said, that they knew that Zahedi was associated with Nazi efforts in Iran during World War II.
Crazy.
And they still wanted to have him be the new prime minister anyway. And I think that really shows where your affiliation lies, because it wasn't that they were saying, well, he was the person who helped the Axis forces during World War II in Iran to establish a good foothold on the ground within Iran, and therefore we should not support a person like that. But it was rather that he was the kind of person who would continue to give the West, I mean in this case the British, but I mean the US obviously wanted some stake in that too, to give them access to the oil. And it even again in that CIA report explicitly says that they just needed that Zahedi, what the one thing was that Zahedi insisted on? He said that the new proposal must at least appear to be more generous. Appear to be more generous.
Right. So first thing, to address the idea, I mean, yeah, it's absolutely insane that Zahedi basically had Nazi affiliations, and then the likes of Winston Churchill, the man who basically fought off Hitler and was one of the biggest, and he even said, I remember there was a quote somewhere stating that although communist or the Russia or the USSR he hated them to his utmost passion, he had to look upon them as allies because the threat of Nazi Germany was just too great.
Yeah.
This is a guy who absolutely reviled the Nazi ideology, and yet he was involved in the overthrow of a potential democratic government, all so that they could protect their interests. But I think further to the point, at this point, we're talking about the 1950s. The Nazi regime is a bygone antagonist. On the other hand, the very real threat at the time was the USSR, at least in the Western eyes. I mean, the U.S., Britain, ultimately the USSR was their antagonist. And Zahedi, in the report, although he had Nazi affiliations, he was adamantly against the Communist Party in Iran. He absolutely reviled them. In fact, there was a report that said that while he was working as the Secretary of Interior for Mossadegh, he basically agreed with most of Mossadegh's policies, including the nationalization of oil, but one thing he couldn't stand was how tolerant Mossadegh was to the Communist Party. And that ultimately led to a lot of tension by the time they broke up. So that was actually looked upon as very favorable at the time. So it doesn't matter that he has Nazi affiliations. He had a pro-Western orientation. He was against the Communist Party in Iran at the time. in their eyes, I mean, the report says it. He was a perfect candidate because, one, he was aggressive, two, he has a pro-Western orientation, and then three, he's against any form of communist regime. I mean, this is like as perfect a Western candidate that you could get with, the minor bruise of him having Nazi affiliations.
Yeah, but I think the part that also plays a significant influence into the decision of backing him is that it wasn't only that he was pro-Western, it wasn't only that he was anti-communist, it was also that he was willing to allow the British or the West essentially to continue to take advantage of them.
Right.
That was a big part of it, because if there's someone who says the agreement at least needs to appear that it's better, not actually better, just appear to be better, that already to me is the sign. And this is from direct communications that the CIA or whoever else, whatever the government agency was that reached out to him, this comes from direct communication between the two entities where Zahedi communicated to the US that it must appear better at the very least, and that the timing needs to be in a way so that the people think that he is somehow doing something that is better than how it was before.
Right.
And sorry, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say that, and the other thing is that there was a section, I don't remember if it was in the same report that I was reading or in another one, where he insisted on, him as in Zahedi, insisted on actually being well, not funded, but well paid, let's say, coming out of this, that he himself wants to have financial benefit coming out of this transaction. Again, kind of playing into this whole like scheme of corruption that was very prevalent during that period of time.
Yeah. I think I know which portion of the report you were talking about. He was promised a substantial cash advance on oil sales, or potentially a grant on it.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So the agreement that eventually came into place after Mossadegh's overthrow and the instance Zahedi took power as prime minister, which interestingly enough, he was only prime minister for 2 years.
Who's Zahedi?
Yeah.
Before we even go there, there was one important part that I really wanted to bring up, which was the willingness, more specifically on the US, because I was able to review their own documents very thoroughly, as did you, where they specifically talk about how they are going to accomplish the goal that they want to accomplish. And the thing that was very daunting to me is that essentially nothing was off the table, right? Like there was no moral standard of we are not going to transgress this line because we think it's morally wrong. It is a very much of a consequentialist type point of view, which is that the end justify the means. So as long as Mossadegh is out, it does not matter how we accomplish this goal, right? So even based on the CIA's own, maybe it wasn't the CIA, it was, I think at that point in time already, a government official, and now I forgot his name, who was giving recommendations to the president during a meeting. And in that meeting, he said, well, here are the things that we can do, right? We can overthrow him through a coup d'etat or royal decree by having the Shah put in a royal decree. And they said, well, and how they can hurt him politically in order to have the people back this kind of a movement too, is that they can, through means of propaganda, poison pen, street riots, tribal support all over Iran, access to news outlets, access to politicians. They knew how many people would vote for Zahedi in a vote of confidence on the floor. Like, they were involved in everything and everywhere. And you know, they explicitly said that the reason why they were not considering assassination was because they feared that the void of Mossadegh would then give rise to a person who is even worse than Mossadegh is right now. That was why they didn't want to assassinate him. Not because it's an international crime. Not because they think it's the wrong thing to do. Not because they think, oh, wow, you know, we are trying to facilitate to the freedom of the world, the betterment of the world, so we're not going to do something crazy like that. No, it's because they were scared that the result might be worse than what currently is in place. And I think that just like really is at the heart of this issue, that it was not strictly about how can we create a world that is free of communism, because we believe that communism itself is a vile philosophy, but rather that how can we use that as an excuse to do something that at the end is what we want to do, because then we will have the most influence over these parts of the country or of the world.
I mean, ultimately, this confirms what a lot of Americans are already feeling today with relation to U.S. foreign policy, which is to say that after the release of all these documents and after endless news coverage saying that foreign intervention in foreign countries is essentially done to protect U.S. to protect U.S. financial interests. I mean, it's something that is almost commonplace at this point. I mean, you could almost say that it was commonplace all the way back to. I mean, when you look at the Vietnam War, the fact that this is a war that was passed on to 3 different administrations, and when you look at some of the reports that came out with relation to Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon, the reports were not that we need to make sure that the reports were not the domino effect, which was to say that if one communist country falls, all of them are going to fall to communism. It wasn't about that. It was the fact that the United States was about to suffer a very grave humiliation, which is to say that during my administration, I lost a war to a third world country, and it's going to completely destroy my legacy. I mean, It was a vanity project to protect the president's pride. That was the reason why it was extended. And when you look at this, you could very much look at it through the same lens. It wasn't about stopping the two-day party, which U.S. officials today, I mean, there were many public declarations stating that ultimately we stifled Iranians' economic development off of this fear that was hyperbolized by U.S. officials that it was going to be overthrown by a communist government.
Yeah.
Which again, even, you know, the funny thing is, if you look at the report itself, even they don't categorize, because at one point they start going down this list of factions that oppose. That would potentially oppose Zahedi's taking of power. And when they list down the two-day party, they said that, okay, these people, the party says that they could start a revolt that involves 10,000 people. But from what our estimates, their operational capacity is about 1,000 people. So even they don't view them as a threat.
Yeah,
and then you go down the list. It's like they go down the Iran Party, the Third Force, the Pan-Iranists. I mean, the Third Force, which was a faction that was very much pro-Mossadegh, they said that this was a group of intellectual socialists that would... There are a group of intellectual socialists that basically are a bunch of highbrow professors that wouldn't even dare walk outside their classrooms.
Yeah, socialist intellectuals. You got to watch out for those.
Socialist intellectual. So it's like the public message is these communists, they're going to take over everything. But in this document that was released, even they expressed saying, yeah, these guys are not that big of a threat.
Yeah.
It's like, ultimately, the thing, and correct me if I'm wrong, the thing that they've worried about the most was that public support was ultimately behind Mossadegh. Mm-hmm. As in, he was still a very, very popular president by that point. There was some division, but I think the majority of the Iranian people were still behind him.
Yeah. And the part that's actually also really interesting to me is that Mossadegh was a person who was, especially for his time and taking into consideration where he was in Iran at that point in time, very secular. And you would think that that is something very attractive to the West as well, who also has a government, although Christianity obviously reigns, it is secular in the sense that it is not a theocracy.
Exactly.
So the fact that they had someone in place now who was not a Muslim theologian who wanted to have Sharia law instated throughout the country, but rather someone who was more based on humanistic values and on, economic values, was rejected due to the fact that he did not conform with this, let's say, malleability that the West expected to just let themselves be screwed over left and right so that, they can do whatever they want.
One thing that was interesting was when you look into the report, they actually go into microscopic detail with the relation to when this amended oil agreement should come out. There was actually, at one point they said, okay, it's going to be too obvious that we coordinated with Zahidi if we immediately come out with an amended oil agreement the day after he takes over the administration.
Yeah.
Which I thought was like, oh, wow, they're they're really thinking about this.
Yeah.
So that element was interesting. And to get more into that agreement, tell me if I'm right about this. I believe that agreement that was reached between Zahedi and the U.S. government was the Consortium Agreement of 1954.
You know what? I don't have that written down exactly like that, so I'll take your word for it.
Okay, well, if anybody is watching and has first-hand knowledge of this, which I seriously doubt anybody does, unless you're like a full-blown Middle Eastern historian, I'm looking at you, Needleman.
Yeah, right.
So this was an agreement that was conducted between Zahidi and the U.S. government in 1954, and essentially an international oil consortium formed, and the agreement that was made the agreement that was made was that the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, their shares of exported oil would be reduced to 40%. Now, off the top of my head, I can't remember what their percentage was in relation to shares on exported oil beforehand. Do you have that off the top of your head?
No. I mean, it was definitely a majority, though. I remember that it was. I don't remember an exact percentage, but it was definitely the majority of the oil that was in Iran.
Right, and so this was it was still a pretty staggering drop. That being said, 40% it's still ridiculous for any secondary country that is for any other trade partner to have that much of a percentage wield on the revenue that was made from exported oil.
Yeah.
40% is ridiculous. And the funny thing is, supposedly the company and the British government were trying to weasel their way out of that 40% and continuously increase the percentage of ownership they had over the shares.
I'm sure.
It's they're so weaselly at this point that nothing surprises us with relation to the British government, but it's still interesting.
Yeah.
So another thing that we should talk about with the relation to the overthrow is, I think, the CIA's direct operational involvement with regards to the operation.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure. Do you know how much do you know about Kermit Roosevelt Jr.?
Nothing.
Nothing. So this guy was the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, and he was basically the ground operational planner for the entirety of Operation Ajax.
Oh, shoot.
He was the guy that sorted through all of it. He was a senior intelligence officer in the CIA, and he was involved in some capacity. Again, my memory is a bit loose on this one, but he was involved in some capacity on the Bay of Pigs invasion, as well as the successful coup d'etat of the Guatemalan government at the time.
Oh, wow.
So he was directly involved here. He went to Iran, and he was stationed in Iran and basically created a litany of networks involving Iranian Anglophiles and Shah sympathizers. And he basically bribed them with hundreds of thousands of US dollars so that they could orchestrate protests around the center of Tehran. So, I mean, you probably know this already, but there were actually 2 coup d'etat attempts with relation to Mossadegh.
Yeah, there was one failed assassination attempt.
Right, and that was actually coordinated by Kermit Roosevelt Jr. as well.
I see.
So Kermit Roosevelt Jr., so he did 2 things with relation to this. One was that he wanted a formal declaration, or he wanted a formal decree signed by the Shah basically dismissing Mossadegh. But beyond that, he also wanted a formal decree from the Shah stating that he wanted the military to essentially take over the government and start a coup d'etat. My mind is a bit hazy on whether or not they wanted him assassinated or not with the first coup d'etat attempt, but as you know, ultimately the first coup d'etat attempt failed. Now, what was interesting about this was that supposedly after this failure, this Kermit Roosevelt Jr. was called by the CIA, and he basically says, they basically tell him, get yourself out of there. Leave the country. This operation is a bust. Mossadegh is still in power. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. stayed. And what he did instead was he's like, you know what? I'm going to basically circulate all these false accounts and telegrams stating that Mossadegh was trying to take over the Shah's throne during that coup d'etat attempt. And while he did this, he also got all these pro-Shah sympathizers, as well as the Iranian Anglophiles. They basically went to the streets and they took out any form of dissident protesters. So the two-day party at the time, the two-day party is actually kind of interesting because, as you know from the report, that the Communist Party was listed as an ally for Mossadegh.
Yeah.
But then after the first coup d'etat, they turned on him. They turned on him and started taking up his public positions and went to the streets and started basically toppling all these statues of the Shah at the time. And Mossadegh had to put down all these protesters, these people who were his allies, up until the last second, and he basically got a bunch of police guards with batons to beat them down, pepper spray them, and then the two-day party was basically defeated.
Yeah.
And then shortly afterwards, Kermit Roosevelt Jr. orchestrates the protests that initiate the second coup d'etat. And the first thing these protesters do is they go to two-day populated areas and they start beating members of the two-day party while burning their vehicles. So these poor guys, they were getting beaten up by both sides. Like, communists can't catch a break in some areas.
Yeah, right.
In some areas, it's like the Soviet Union where they completely take over power. But then other places, it's like Iran and Nazi Germany. In Nazi Germany, once the National Socialist Party took over, every single communist in Germany was just arrested.
Yeah.
Arrested and eventually tried and executed or put into labor camps. Here, everybody hated them, and eventually the entirety of the party was put down, and then they never recovered after the point.
Yeah.
It's outstanding. But again, what's just I'm sorry, I'm probably talking a bit too much right now.
No,
But
go ahead.
just a last point. It's just interesting that one intelligence officer planted in Iran with millions upon millions of dollars given to him for this operation, and these millions of dollars stored in caches. He basically bribed a litany of he bribed a litany of political dissidents, protesters, political groups, and he talked to Zahidi's son directly. And I mean, this guy was single-handedly involved in the orchestration of Operation Ajax.
Yeah.
It's kind of incredible.
Yeah, the two things that definitely strike me as extraordinary during this whole process too is one is now, okay, this one is not necessarily extraordinary, but it's something that I think speaks to the tone of the top, right? What's the tone of the top? Eisenhower, there's a transcript from him in a meeting saying to, like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, a bunch of government officials that were the top dogs at the time, that if he had, and I'm essentially paraphrasing from that transcript, which was if he would have $500 million, and at that time that was a lot of money, to spend however he wanted, he would give $100 million to Iran just to buy the problem, like to make it go away through money. And that's kind of the thing, the whole thing was like, let's just throw money at them so that people stop making problems,
Yeah, but I'll say I'll say in all these cases is a bit more complex than that, because if we're just handing down money to Iran, then a whole bevy of other problems could probably occur. But they're calculated. They're they're very prudent about who they give their money to in Iran.
Yeah.
So it's like, again, the CIA is very prudent with their selection of who's going to be the prime minister. They're very selective on which political groups they should ally with and what networks they should establish so that they could orchestrate a litany of protests that causes dismay and dissent across the entire country. Where they send money, it's very calculated. So I wouldn't just say they throw the money at the problem and then it goes away. No, according to these documents, the amount of planning that goes to these things is absolutely ludicrous. But it also makes a lot of sense because, again, ultimately, this thing worked out.
Yeah, it did work out. And, to speak to a point that you were saying earlier, which was the U.S. really recognized that the Shah's involvement was absolutely critical in this process.
Oh, yeah.
So
absolutely.
They knew that Zahedi himself would not be capable to overthrow Mossadegh. And so they not only needed to, speak to the Shah sympathizers and get them rallied up, but they also needed to get the Shah himself involved and have him, like you were saying, get involved especially from the military aspect, because what was going on was that they wanted to essentially have a military coup, to have the military revolt against the government so that they can then reinstate people who were in place beforehand, in this case. And they knew that the only way they could really do that is if the Shah gives direct orders to people in the military who would then possibly act out on those orders, and that it would be very unlikely that if Zahedi were to give those orders that anyone would act out on them.
Absolutely.
And then the thing was that, the way that they approached the Shah was very manipulative. If you look at the way that they approached him, they even say explicitly in the documents how they talked to him. It was very much like, this is in the best interest of your country, you need to step up as a leader, and this and that. And it was, like they're talking to him like they're trying to do him a favor and he needs to do this for the betterment of his country and his people and this and that. Right. And, just to kind of get it their way.
Right. No, it's actually really interesting because when you look at, they basically did a psychoanalytical report
Yeah,
on the
they
Shah,
did.
where they talked about, oh, here are all his positive leadership traits, but here's a list of also all his negative traits, like the fact that he's incredibly indecisive, and he's also kind of a bit of a worm in that he says he'll commit to something, but when the call for action comes, he'll back out of it immediately.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, what was interesting was, okay, one was that this Kermit Roosevelt was actually involved in the Shah eventually signing the decree. But you know that after the first coup d'etat, the Shah basically left Iran.
Yeah?
He left Iran and he went to, was it Egypt first?
I don't know where he first went, but he didn't quite leave. He got exiled, didn't he?
Well, he got exiled for a very short period of time then. I think
Because I thought I mean, I may be incorrect about this, and we can maybe clarify this after.
we might need to backtrack on this.
But I thought I remembered that after the first coup attempt, he was actually exiled, and he was in exile, and then they went to the Shah while he was in exile and approached him with all of this. And I think the thing was also he kind of knew that the only way for him to really get back in the game was by working with the West, that he himself
Right.
essentially kind of lost the battle in that sense.
Right, because from what I could recollect, he was very much for Mossadegh's nationalization of oil. He was never happy about the 1933 agreement that his father had established with the Iranian Anglo Oil Company. So, yeah, so he basically did fold to the West and became a Western asset for all intents and purposes. But again, about his exile, I'm not sure whether he was exiled or whether or not he ran away. I think he went to Egypt first, but then he I know he went to Rome, and he was actually very nefarious in Rome. He had a lot of salacious activity there. He went to nightclubs. He had mistresses. He had a lot of salacious, not affairs, but he was with Queen Soraya and nightclubs a lot. And in fact, what was really interesting is that the one person who really convinced or persuaded the Shah to sign the decree dismissing Mossadegh was in fact one of his sisters, Princess Ashrat. It was interesting. She was actually in communications with Kermit Roosevelt and other U.S. officials. And she basically what she did to persuade the Shah was that she constantly questioned his manhood.
Oh.
Like, she just went up to him and just said, "You're really compensating for a lot." I'm paraphrasing there, obviously.
Yeah.
But no, it was ultimately his sister who did, because, again, as these U.S. documents say, apparently the Shah wasn't the most resolute of guys. He was a bit of I wouldn't say Benedict Arnold, but he turned away in the face of danger, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But from what I read, he's actually a very astute politician, and what he did, because if I remember correctly, at the time during Mossadegh's reign, Iran was a constitutional monarchy.
Yeah, I think that is correct.
But then, after Mossadegh's overthrow, the Shah actually gained quite a bit of power after that point, because beforehand, the Shah was a figurehead. After the removal of both Mossadegh, but then eventually the Shah also wanted to get rid of Zahedi, the Shah gained a lot of power for himself.
Yeah, he did. And I mean, I think that's then what really also led into the 1979 revolution, because of his, overexertion of his power, let's say.
Right, and also the fact that a lot of Iranians looked at him as a Western asset.
Yeah, which he was.
Which absolutely he was. He betrayed all his values that he so adamantly proclamated before before being contacted by the West.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess that's a good transitioning point. Do we want to move into the 1979 revolution now?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good transition point. I mean, I do kind of want to touch on one small thing in between, which was, I think, the most, let's say, noteworthy, policy that he implemented during his reign between, the mid 50s when he came back into power and the late 70s was the White Revolution, when he was putting up these huge projects of infrastructure and road building and modernization. And actually during that time it gave him a lot of backing and support, because people were actually happy with that type of government spending, of kind of modernizing the lives and building roads and having electricity more widely distributed throughout the country, etc., etc. Right. So I think sometimes it's important to give a little bit of nuance into these things too, that it's not like it was all bad or he only did bad things. I think ultimately, obviously, we do not want to live in a monarchy, and we don't want people to live in a monarchy, but not everything he did was necessarily bad. And I think that was definitely kind of like a highlight of his reign during that time, that his second reign, let's say.
Nobody wants to live in a monarch unless the monarch in power is serving as a monarch solely so that he could establish a transitionary government that eventually becomes a democracy.
Yeah, and that
I'm talking about Ataturk, baby.
Yeah. No, Ataturk was good. I mean, I didn't do enough research into the Ottoman Empire and that transition right now, but Ataturk also, I mean, he was also in power longer than anticipated, and it's kind of hard, but he did pass on his power without any
absolutely
retaliation or war, or oh no, I'm going to stay in power and take advantage of the situation.
He set up a parliament. He decided all the vanguard traditions surrounding the Ottoman Empire, particularly with relation to Islamic traditions, will no longer become government jurisprudence. It won't be standardized into government law anymore.
Yeah.
He established a secular government and essentially modernized Turkey for a large portion of time until that shill of a man Erdogan came into power.
Erdogan, yeah.
God, Erdogan, that's a whole nother ball game. Let's go back to the Iranian Revolution. So you mentioned the White Revolution and all the modernization and all the money that was being allocated to infrastructure. Sounds great. So ultimately, what happened? Why all the dismay? Why the eventual overthrow?
Rhetorical question, or are you actually asking me?
A rhetorical question, but answer the rhetorical question.
Well, I mean, one was that a specific portion of the population was generally very underserved and underrepresented, more specifically students, professors, so people that are in academia, laborers, people who would, kind of like the middle class type of people, and also actually religious people were very upset with the regime at the time. And I mean, it had a lot to do with the fact, or with the degree of Western influence at the time, with the lack of liberties that some people within the state endured, and then eventually that led to a revolt, which, interesting enough, really just started off as kind of like a working class, middle class revolt against a corrupt government, but then really spun out of control into something completely different by almost chance, in a sense. I mean, it wasn't planned from the beginning, it wasn't like, from the beginning we're just going to make it seem like it's X but then turn it into Y. It was more just as events unfolded during that time, it just completely changed course. And but I mean, please go ahead and give some more, nuance and details into this.
Oh, well, no, God, no. I only have a loose assortment of notes pertaining to the Iranian Revolution, and I'm only going by what I remember from my modern Middle Eastern course.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, over time, like you said, this was a workers' revolution that, in many respects, looked a lot like. When you look at photographs, it actually reminds me a lot of what modern day protests look like today, or what the 60s protests looked like during the Vietnam War. It was very tranquil to a certain extent. And then suddenly, religious autocrats hijacked the entire revolution. And
Yeah, but I think that, just to step in here really quickly, that the main reason why that even really happened was because the crackdown on the religious leaders, or, the religious faction of the revolution, let's say at that point in time, was being so heavily cracked down on. And that ultimately was also a big appeal to the people, because it's kind of like, to use a more modern example, it's they were really high on the oppression scale. They they were the ones who were the most oppressed, the most shut down, and then that in turn was counterproductive to what the government was trying to achieve at that point in time, which was to crack them down. Instead, it really made them kind of the leaders by default, just by being the ones who are hit the worst, so to speak. And they then had an influential part to play. And obviously also, was it still Khomeini? Khomeini at the time, who was in exile, and then from his position in exile was just like riling up everyone and saying all kinds of stuff, and how he's going to come back and be the leader and this and that, and
right, and like prophetic revelation, it came true.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me, because I sometimes still don't quite fully understand how all of that came into place, because when you had all those people revolting at that point in time, it was, now even looking back, when I look at the things that were being said and done, I don't quite understand fully the appeal that those religious leaders had in the eye of the general public, because the things that they were saying were usually like, oh, we need to get back to, Muslim standards and the brotherhood and treat each other well and this and that. And I think maybe that's kind of what it was. It went back to this, to the brotherhood type message of, we need to stick together, we need to be good to each other and treat each other well, etc., etc. Maybe that was the appeal, but the fact that it spun into that, even if they were the most oppressed, is still interesting to me, and definitely something that would need some more discussion and research.
I think so. I think this requires a lot more research, because, like you said, the transitionary period for a long time was that Iran was moving towards modernity. So for them to suddenly, for these religious zealots to suddenly come in and propagate this idea of community and collectivization and the need to not only better ourselves, but to uphold these standards of Islamic doctrine, let's say. It's interesting. I don't know how to quite wrap my head around it, but I mean, currently the results that sprung up from the aftermath, I'm sure that a majority of the Iranian public right now has deep regrets.
Yes, I would agree. I mean, again, the thing is that I think a lot of times something sounds really good, or leaders that are very charismatic, because Khomeini was very charismatic. I mean, even if you listen to him and see him at that point in time, he was very influential, he was very charismatic, and he definitely had deep roots into the culture as well. I mean, he's been around for a long time. He was also involved in that power struggle of the 50s between, Zahedi and the Shah and Mossadegh, and he was kind of in the thickets of that too. And he was around for a long time, and it just goes a long way to be in that position and then use that in a way to put yourself up as a leader. And I think him having been exiled and the religious portion of the revolution having been cracked down upon so harshly really added to the appeal that it had to the people, my enemy's enemy is my friend kind of a situation. And
sure.
But yeah, I mean, I would agree that if we were to go to Iran and take a poll right now, which is not allowed, but if we could, I am
exactly
pretty sure that if people were honest, now again, I don't know, I'm hypothesizing here, but I would say that based on the living conditions that are currently in place in a lot of places of Iran, and the lack of political and freedom of expression that they have, would definitely reflect in that as well, in their opinion of the current regime.
Well, for the sake of time, let's transition to Iran today, because on that front, there is quite a lot to talk about in lieu of a litany of recent developments that within the span of our modern news cycle seems like 5 years ago.
Yeah.
But in reality, it's only been 2 to 3 weeks, and my goodness, from what I could recall, if you go stretch back 2 or 3 weeks ago, every single major publication had an article written pertaining to Soleimani. You look at today, there was, I think I might be transitioning too fast, but there was a case, right? There was a case where there was a commander, an Iranian commander by the name of Abul Hussein. He was the head of the Basij forces, which is one of the pillars of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And he basically headed all his forces to suppress any form of protests as a result of the Ukrainian plane that crashed, as well as a litany of other circumstances surrounding Iran. This dude was shot by two guys on motorbikes. He was shot right outside his home. This is a commander, the commander of a major faction in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, shot dead. Do you know how many articles covered it? Do you know how many major publications covered the story?
1.
2.
It
was the Jerusalem Post and the Washington Examiner. Those were the only 2 big publications that covered this massive story pertaining to Iran. Massive because it expresses the fact that political dissent has gone so high that the top brass of the Iranian military board are being killed off, not just by foreign powers, mind you, but by locals on motorbikes.
Yeah, the complete mayhem.
Complete mayhem. Nobody's covering it, so spare me your crocodile tears about, these Iranians, they're outside of Soleimani's funeral and they're all crying. They all loved Soleimani so much. Like, God, the coverage on that story was just despicable.
Yeah, I mean, again, it unintentionally, relates to what I was saying earlier. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And I think by having villainized Trump to the degree that we have done in the U.S. so far, especially from, the more pretty much anyone that's left of right of center, because I think even people right of center are very displeased with, generally speaking, with what Trump represents and what he has done, that it's like, oh, well, they were, in opposition to Trump, and so they kind of downplay some of the things that are going on over there, because again, Iran does not really have a track record, especially not in the last, let's say, 40 years, to represent Western values, right?
Absolutely not.
And by Western values, I would even go further and say, more specifically, to say liberal Western values. And again, it's kind of it's a weird, touchy subject, though, because at the same time, I don't agree personally with a lot of the things that the Iranian regime and the Iranian government has represented and has done in the last 40 years. But at the same time, I also vehemently oppose this execution-style drone attack on, such a high-profile on anyone, but specifically in this case, high-profile government official, with laws in place that were so outdated, in place almost 18 years later, by doing something like that. So it's also, I'll give the media a little bit of a benefit of doubt, which is it's hard to cover, because on one hand, you don't want to excuse, Soleimani's act that he has, delegated within the last, during his time of influence. But at the same time, you also don't want to condemn Trump's behavior of just bombing people all over the world.
Right. I mean, in many respects, both these entities are acting as the public executioners of individuals that don't even pertain to domestic law. It's just, I mean, okay, so on the one hand, we have Iran, who is basically funneling money to a litany of Iranian proxies across the regions and sowing chaos wherever they go. We have the Houthis in Yemen, we have Hezbollah in Lebanon, we have Hamas in the Gaza Strip. We have an assortment of different militias in Syria, including the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They basically have their hands everywhere. And their funding, their arming these Shia militias has resulted in several thousand casualties. And look, the thing is, I don't agree. And then on the other side of the equation, we have Trump, and even beforehand Obama, who, at least Iran has the cojones to do not say that, oh, we are the watchdogs, we are the police force of the world, we're here to maintain some semblance of international law, the same way that the U.S. plasters itself. I mean, look, the Iranians just sow chaos. That's it. You don't see Khomeini making public declarations that we're trying to save the Middle East. I mean, that would be preposterous. But on the other hand, we have individuals like Trump who say that we need to have boots on the ground constantly to ensure that there is less violence in the world. In the meantime, again, there are civilians that are being drone striked because they're in close proximity to a supposed militia target or terrorist target of some sort, and collateral damage doesn't matter as long as we take out that one target. So it's like, where does the line between sanctioned airstrikes and terrorist attacks blur?
Yeah, that's a great point. And even recently I was thinking about that a lot. I was thinking, how can we not think of ourselves as living in a country that acts like terrorists? I mean, we are really terrorizing people by, on one hand, we are giving weapons to countries and organizations that we know will use it in a way that is definitely not in line with the general public's view of what Western values represent. If you were to go, at least if you were to ask me, I guess I don't want to speak on other people's behalf, and you were to ask me what Western values represent, in my opinion, it would definitely not be, let's give weapons to countries that will then turn around and go bomb markets full of people because there might be one or two rebels in there that oppose their regime.
Right.
And then on the other hand, I would also say definitely not represent Western values when we decide to carpet bomb, portions of the Middle East because we have decided that doing so is in our best interest because there might be one or two guys who we see as a national threat. And, if you're some kid living in Yemen and your parents died because of a bomb strike at a market that your parents went to, how is that kid not going to live in terror the rest of his or her life? How is that not a form of terrorizing people, civilians, for purely political reasons?
Right. You know what's interesting? I mean, when you think about civilians in this grand geopolitical narrative, if we look at it through the lens of a chessboard, they're not even the pawns. They're the microbes that are on top of the board that are being stepped on by these massive chess pieces.
Yeah.
In that, I mean, not to compare people to microbes, obviously, but
no, I get it.
There was this great movie called Vice, and it basically it was a biopic on Dick Cheney, and it basically there was this one sequence where Dick Cheney and members of the Bush cabinet got together for dinner, and there was this scene that juxtaposed them in this really lovely 5-star restaurant. They were laughing. They were talking about, they were basically making a litany of jokes pertaining to collateral damage. And then you juxtapose that with a sequence where this Iraqi family is basically hiding under a table while the country is being carpet bombed by U.S. bombers.
Yeah.
And it was, I don't know, it was this great sequence where it's like, it showcased that, to people who are, what do you call it? To the leaders and to the people who are basically financing these regime changes, these wars, and are trying to solicit as much global conflict as possible. They really don't care about those individual people who are dislocated, disenfranchised, then have to completely migrate away from the country and go somewhere else. And even there, the living conditions are just terrible.
Yeah, and to speak to your chess analogy, I think you're right that civilians are not even pawns, because pawns are like the foot soldiers,
Exactly.
The pawns are still, in a sense, quote unquote, willing participants in the war between two sides, right?
Right.
The pawns are just the ones you would be least concerned about if you were to need to dispose of them. Right?
Those would be the soldiers.
Those would be the foot soldiers, your frontline infantry. And not that I agree with that point of view, but that's what it represents from a chess analogy. And the civilians essentially have no part in that war, in the sense of, that they're not active participants, but rather they're just in the way.
Absolutely. Without a doubt. Well, the thing is,
they're the debris on the chessboard, let's say. Not, they're the ones that you just kind of like swipe them off the table so that you can have the pawn make his move or whatever.
Exactly. But the thing is that eventually, I mean, at a point, these conflicts are all the people that live in these countries know. The constant threat of having this potentially violent faction enter their town and start looting their houses, or to be carpet bombed by American bombers to a certain extent, or the potential of a drone strike coming in. So there comes a point where God, how do I put this? I want to make this sound as delicate. I want to make this come across as delicately as possible. But there comes a point where that microbe wants to enter the chessboard. So let's say, for example, I mean, I think this is true for any conflict, that if you're an orphan, if your parents become victims of war, then some people might feel the inclination or need to join the opposing faction. Am I partially correct revenge. In saying this?
Yeah, of course, to either take revenge or I mean, to avenge your parents, essentially, right? You're joining the group that is fighting the enemy.
And that's what the funny thing is, the wheels of violence in many respects continue on these interpersonal grounds within these regional conflicts. But the people, again, this is always what aggravates me, is that the people who are involved in orchestrating these world wars, the military-industrial complex, or a secretary of state that has more power than he or she should, they orchestrate these conflicts, and then they basically don't, I mean, they have their hands dirty, but they are never directly involved in these conflicts. I mean, these are obvious points, but
yeah, to bring it back to kind of the topic of discussion that we chose for this podcast, I think that the difficulty of, especially from a current lens, on one hand, we have hindsight of looking at all these past historical events, and it's sometimes easy to fall into the trap of pointing fingers of like, oh, they did this, and then they did that, and then they did this, and then just kind of like pointing fingers to the wrongdoings of everyone involved in all of this fiasco. But then at the end of the day, I feel like it's also important to kind of take a step back and say, well, let's not necessarily fall into the trap of pointing fingers and trying to find a culprit, one villain, one, entity that then can represent all of the wrongs that have, we attribute all. I'm not saying that's what we're doing here, either of us, but a lot of times that becomes part of the narrative. It's like, we need to find a villain, we need to find a culprit. And I think by looking at all of this that has happened, sometimes we lose track of the people that are actually still involved in this, in the sense that, like, the civilians that we talked about right now, where is the focus on the people who need that help? And there are organizations and institutions that do that. I don't want to take away from that, but I think a lot of times we get lost in the thickets of trying to find this villain. Who can we villainize? Who can we say, oh, it's his fault that all of this happened, right? But then we kind of lose track of what's going on with the people involved on the ground who are living under those circumstances. What about them?
No, I absolutely 1000% agree with that sentiment. We live in a day and age where it seems like we want our lives, we want our ideas, we want our tribes we want our narratives to play out like stories, like general tropish fantasy stories, or just tropey Hollywood stories of any sort, where, like you said, there is a villain and there is a good guy. If you look at the right, they say it's the socialists, it's the communists. You look at the left, it's the white supremacists everywhere. You look at the Middle East, it's Israel.
Yeah.
And you're right to say that oftentimes we lose track of the people who are on the ground. In relation to the U.S., it's the working class, it's the blue-collar worker. In relation to people in the Middle East, it's very much the same thing. It's about not only people who are losing their jobs, but people who are experiencing cataclysmic circumstances where drinking water is tainted by oil because oil reservoirs spilled over to water reservoirs in some cases, and there are massive water shortages somewhere. And when all is said and done, turning this to the U.S. for a second, when the 2020 election finally comes underway and the ballot boxes are full and the results come in, I think all the noise that has been propagated about certain policy issues or certain social issues is going to be irrelevant in the overall turnout. Which is to say that I think ultimately, look, most people aren't like us in that most people don't obsessively follow politics.
Yeah.
They don't microanalyze every single candidate and talk about every single small miniature of their life going back 20 years to find a political statement that could ultimately get them overturned from the candidacy. Right?
Sure. Yeah.
Most people aren't like that. Most people are just trying to live their lives day by day, in some cases paycheck by paycheck, and they're trying to provide a better life for their family or for their loved ones, and that is ultimately going to be reflected off their vote. And I also think the same thing is true for any topic. I mean, I know I'm flip-flopping right now, but look at the 2016 migration crisis on Europe. It was politicized to such a degree that many European natives just immediately started stereotyping Muslim migrants as people who didn't automatically disseminate or assimilate into our culture. And as a result, they were quote-unquote problematic.
Yeah.
But then you look at video footage of any single one of these individuals, and you just realize these are people that are trying to make it.
Yeah. They were living under circumstances that are practically impossible to live under, and they want to live peacefully. They want to live, comfortably. And by comfortably, I don't mean in excess or luxury, but just, with bare minimum essential requirements to live with comfort, to have food on the table, to have clothes on your back, to have a roof over your head, to be able to, walk around in the streets without worrying that something bad is going to happen. I mean, very reasonable,
exactly.
requests.
Exactly. And the problem at the end of the day for all of these groups, and this is where the villainization portion of it comes in. The fact is, within any tribe, there's always going to be a few bad apples.
Yeah, of
This
course.
is true for every single tribe. It's not just Muslims. It's not just white people. It's everybody.
Yeah.
And the fact is, when these events are politicized, we don't focus on the individual. We just focus on, what are the collective problems of the group?
Yeah.
And as a result of those stereotyping, we don't look at certain people that belong to a tribe as an individual. We start collectivizing. And I mean, it's wrong on so many levels. I mean, on the one hand, if you're a white blue-collar worker, then you're obliged to vote for the Republican Party to some capacity. If you are an African-American, then you're obliged to vote for the Democratic Party. I know I'm going into sticky terrain at this point, but the idea is that when you look at the way that media will portray the media or political organizations or groups or individuals will start portraying certain individuals, we forget about the individual who is living in completely unique circumstances from their neighbor. If that makes sense.
Yeah, of course.
So, in fact, I think that's actually that would be a good topic to unravel and talk about next week, which is we could start talking about individuals that are affected by massive geopolitical circumstances and how those individuals are affected. We could talk about individual stories or biographies that have been shared. Yeah. And look at events through the lens of the individual. And that might help recontextualize these macro political events and actually add a human element to it.
Yeah, for sure. I agree.
All right, I talked enough.
Well, maybe we both did. I don't know. That seems like a pretty good end to me, segue into next week. It's kind of like a sneak peek of next week. We can... or next podcast episode, and just kind of go from there. But I really think that we definitely we kind of got in a little detour at the end of it, but I think the kind of main points concerning the Iranian history, more so a little bit further in the past than recent. I think we talked more about 70 years ago than we did 20 years ago, but I think that it was definitely very interesting to cover, because those things are not usually covered by many people know about the Iranian Revolution, many people know about recent events and the nuclear deal and all that stuff going on with Trump, because that gets a lot of coverage, whereas what we talked about definitely does not get a lot of coverage, or practically any.
Right. Well, what the problem with current day politics and the coverage of topics that don't usually get a lot of coverage, but if somehow it fits into our current political mold, let's say that Trump gets involved in Iran, that suddenly everybody has a take. But the problem is, at the end of the day, it's a take. So, for example, when Soleimani was murdered, the take was either, Soleimani was a bad man that killed hundreds of American soldiers and thousands of Syrians, he deserved to die. And that was the extent of the political analysis on the right, as far as I could see. And then you go on the left, and again, it's the argument that we shouldn't act as the watchdogs of the world. We have more in common with the Iranian people than we do with the current heads of power, let's say. It's like the problem is that the political analysis of today is ultimately broken down into sound bites. They don't really get into depth surrounding... They don't really talk about the historical implications or events that surround Iran. What led to the disaster that is the Soleimani strike today. We just want to talk about, one, how it relates to Trump, and then two, how can we use it to defend Trump?
Yeah. Well, actually, I do want to give one person credit who I, during all of this, listened to and thought, wow, he actually gave a pretty decent account of all of this, was Tucker Carlson. I don't know if you saw his segment, but I thought his segment on the Soleimani attack was actually pretty good for the most part. I didn't agree with everything that he was saying, but he definitely was one of the only, more mainstream people on the right who gave a more reasonable perspective on everything that was happening.
No, I haven't seen Tucker Carlson's perspective. The perspectives that I did see was Ben Shapiro, who I didn't think had the greatest take.
Yeah, I agree.
He really is kind of a neocon the more I think about it.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because Yeah, I mean that's maybe a whole other thing to get into.
Yeah. I don't want to dive too deeply into the psyche of an individual, but no, I just want. I mean, his take. I listened to Rachel Maddow's take, which was a mistake. Yeah. Anybody in MSM, David Pacman and Kyle Kalinske from Secular Talk had some pretty good takes on this event as well.
Yeah.
Tulsi Gabbard is just brilliant as usual. I love that person.
Yeah.
All right. Well, before we cast off, do we want to diverge for 10 minutes and just talk about anything?
Yeah. I was going to suggest that. So, I think a small introduction would be good. Maybe if you want to kind of give a little segue into this section of the podcast.
Totally. So, just to recount, I mean, everything. Usually, how this podcast is going to work from this point onwards is we are going to focus on a single topic for the majority of this podcast. We're going to do our best to research it. We're going to be as thorough as possible. At the same time, this is a pretty natural diegetic conversation. So if we do, what's the term I'm looking for? If we do sort of cast away from the central topic, we apologize sincerely for that. But ultimately, I do think we do a good job of maintaining the topic at hand. So, yeah, ultimately, the majority of the podcast is going to be about one single topic, but then we were hoping that for the last 10 minutes, we would just have a casual conversation, not surrounding geopolitical events or crises or coronaviruses that are spreading across the globe, but just a simple, casual thing about how are you, how am I, what crap have you been watching recently, what's your hot take, and then we cap off from there.
Yes, sir.
Was that good enough?
Yeah, that's perfect.
All right, Bayan. So, how are you?
I'm pretty good. I mean, so right now we like in the audit world, for the most part right now we're in what is called busy season. So I'm mostly working 12-hour days right now, and so I've been working a lot, but besides that, actually, things are good. I'm doing well right now.
Great. How's your family life?
Family life is fine. I mean, it's a little bit negligible right now just due to the time of year. But, I mean, everything's good. Everyone's good. I mean, family life includes you, so I guess we're still going strong. How about you?
I mean, every time somebody asks you or tells you why have you stopped staying in touch with the family, you just say no. I talked to Sina.
Yeah, there we go. He's family
from across the globe. I know you guys are 30 minutes away, but I'd rather talk to the guy 500 miles away.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. No, I've been doing good. Working hours have been. It's actually a pretty slow season too. We've been getting less donations and less requests for donations. Actually, I never talked about it. I'm currently in Haifa, and I'm taking a temporary service position in Haifa, Israel, at the Baha'i World Center, it's basically this massive religious center that mediates everything that the Baha'i faith does on a national and local level. And we have all these separate sections and departments that mediate different things. We have secretariats, we have correspondence, we have archives that deal with a variety of topics that I don't really want to get into right now. But basically, I work at the archive section, and I serve there as an archival assistant, and it's fun. I enjoy it. There's a lot of historical analyses. There's a lot of preservation of neat historical documents. That's all I'm going to get into at this point. Yeah, I'm doing pretty well.
That's good. So tell me about just some things you've been watching, reading, listening to, whatever recently that's interesting.
Okay, dude,
Huh.
I gotta talk about this. I think I've told this to you already, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it for months. So I've been watching Attack on Titan and reading it. And I'm at a point with this series and manga series that I think this is the greatest piece of fantasy fiction that I've possibly ever read.
Damn.
It is just brilliant. And for anybody listening, for anybody listening who might be familiar with Attack on Titan, it all started with chapter 122. That is all I will say. Spoiler alert, not really, but it's just fantastic, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it, and it does a lot of things similarly to what One Piece does, which is that it establishes something at the very first episode, a teaser, an Easter egg, something, a character that you thought was miscellaneous, but then eventually becomes part of this 100 episode arc. It sets things up and pays them off in the most remarkable fashion that I have ever seen any piece of fiction do. And it's getting to a point where the manga has reached the end game. We're reaching the final 12 chapters of the manga. And it's blowing my mind in every direction, and it's so satisfying because after the disaster that was Game of Thrones, and after hearing and reading so many fantasy series where either the writer has stopped writing or he died by the time the book series was completed, it's just so satisfying to get an ending that is not just good, not just great, but it blew my expectations so far off the roof that I have not been able to stop thinking about it ever since I read that one stupid chapter. And now it's basically dominated every single part of my brain where I cannot stop thinking about it. Okay, that's it for me. How's One Piece doing these days?
I mean, One Piece is doing amazing. I'm looking forward to read the newest chapter right now. I mean, I feel the same way about One Piece that you do about Attack on Titan, where it's, in my opinion, I mean, so far, probably just the greatest story ever told. I know that I'm probably biased towards that, but it's more just, I have yet to see a story that has been ongoing for 20 plus years that is consistently good. I mean, it's like you have almost 1,000 chapters, and there is yet a chapter that I haven't read a chapter yet that I would say that was bad. Like somewhere maybe okay, like, oh, that chapter was okay or not that eventful, or it's not like every single chapter is, blowing my mind, but to have that kind of a consistency for 20 years, and then just the storytelling, the foreshadowing, it's like as if he had all of this planned out from the very beginning, and then just fills in the gaps,
Right.
And
yeah, I get the impression that what's the name of the One Piece writer?
Eiichiro Oda.
Okay.
Eiichiro Oda.
Eiichiro Oda. We're gonna be blacklisted for Asian stereotyping now.
I know.
This is terrible. What a terrible ending. But okay, Oda. The name of the Attack on Titan manga writer, his name is Hajime Isayama. I think, because from everything I've had, there are so many One Piece fans in the Baha'i World Center, you will be shocked.
Oh, sure.
And they've been spoiling everything for me, and I hate it. But one thing that seems similar, like for me, Attack on Titan, and from what I've been hearing about One Piece, is I get the impression that for One Piece, for example, that the writer has basically worked backwards, where he constructed the world, he constructed all these hierarchies first, and then somewhere at the very, very end, he decided to construct a central character.
it's possible. I would be very interested in how he does it, because the thing that is so mind-blowing to me about One Piece, when mind-blowing is going to be the word of the day for us, is that the world is so unbelievably extensive. I mean, it's unbelievably extensive that I don't even understand how he himself can keep track of everything that is going on. No, really, Sina, like, it's crazy. Because you have this whole world, and you have all these different groups, and all these groups come from like a larger group, and they all have this historical element to it, and the government does this and this and that, and then you like, even as the reader, you lose track of things. It's like, I read about something 10 years ago, and now all of a sudden it pops up again. I'm like, oh my God, I completely forgot about that. You know, it's even as the reader, you start losing track of like all these little things, hints that were dropped throughout, or something where it's like, oh yeah, remember that one time when you heard about this one thing? Well, now you will understand the significance of it 12 years later. Like, Jesus.
Right. No, I mean, well, that's something that Attack on Titan will never have on One Piece, which is the fact that this thing has been going on for 1,000 chapters. The world building is so unbelievably extensive, and yet somehow it's not convoluted. At the end of the day, everything makes sense. Everything connects, and it's unbelievably satisfying as a result.
Yeah, but that was not actually what I would have brought up on my own for myself right now.
Sorry?
I said that was not what I would have brought up on my own for myself right now. Although, I mean, I'm obsessing over One Piece too, but actually I have been reading a lot of Immanuel Kant's work. Yeah, dude. I got this like book just that is a compilation of all of his work, called, they just called it Practical Philosophy. And it's definitely been very rewarding so far. Very interesting.
Great. Yeah, no, Kantian ethics is a very interesting minefield to put your mind to. I'm trying to think of what philosophy texts I've been looking through.
Yeah, it's hard to.
Just a tad
now
bit
you're
on
gonna
David
have me read
Hume.
it too.
I read a little bit on a guy named Guy Debord. He's a French philosopher. He wrote a book called The Optical of Society. I'm just reading the transcript. Oh, it's interesting, but yeah, it's good. It's good, but yeah, I guess my mind is still on Attack on Titan. No, no, but it's because here's the thing. Do you know? Okay, so I think the reason why this narrative has struck such a chord for me is because you know, the both of us are very hyper aware of current political narratives that are playing out across society to a certain extent. The idea that we have to constantly villainize another group, the fact that there always has to be a bad guy or a good guy, or a bad group or a good group. The fact that if you're a victim, then you're always a victim. Doesn't matter. We don't have to look at the historical context. You're always a victim. And I guess the thing about Attack on Titan, and it's so weird because this is literally a show about a bunch of naked man-eating giants clobbering the remnants of humanity. When you look at that first season, you think, okay, it's fun, it's great, it is visceral, it is like tense, it is action-packed, but it lacks substance. That was my impression. I'm like, this is an action show. It's an action shonen anime. I like it, but there's nothing to it.
Yeah.
And then you read everything, you go to the end game, you revisit it, and through your second watching, you realize all these little Easter eggs that were planted at the very beginning. All these little slight plot elements that ultimately build up to this unbelievable conclusion. And you realize, holy shit, this guy has such an unbelievable understanding of the human condition every single plot point that he has surmised, I am unbelievably on board with. It is okay. Anyways, look, I'll make a deal with you right now. Let's end it here. Let's end it here.
Okay.
I will finally start One Piece. I will finally start watching One Piece if you start watching Attack on Titan.
I'll alter that deal. I'll start reading Attack on Titan. And you can watch or read One Piece. I would suggest for you to read it just because watching it is going to take an unbelievable amount of time. It's really good. The animation is great and everything, but I mean, you got 800 something episodes right now with essentially no fillers. So
wait a second. Are you saying reading it is going to take... Well, yeah, reading it is going to be much faster than going through the anime.
So
no, I agree. I'll start reading the manga and you start reading Attack on Titan.
All right.
And it's by the way, it's only 125 chapters.
Okay, done.
Thank God. This is a great place to end it on. All right.
I agree.
Well, Bayan, it's been fun. It's been real. I hope we... What do you want to say? You want to do this weekly or do you want to do this monthly? Or bi-monthly?
Yeah, let's try to do bi-weekly. Bi-monthly would be every 2 months. So semi-monthly would be twice a month. Bi-weekly every 2 weeks. I think every 2 weeks should be good. Especially now it's hard for me to do that every week, but every 2 weeks should be good.
All right, perfect. And thank you guys for watching. For the 10 people who are watching, in which all of you are probably family members.
Well, actually, no one is watching. That makes it even worse.
Oh, crap, you're right.
Listening.
Well, in that case, I'm talking to myself. Okay, let's just end it here.
Thanks everyone for listening. We had a really good time and we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, and we'll definitely be back with more.